Hey guys, how y'all doing today? So last week we started looking at the U.S. presidents, and we're going to continue right along. I had hopes to get all the way to the Civil War, and I didn't. I ran out of time. So this time we're going to start with the 10th president, and we're going to work our way up to the Civil War this time. All right, this is John Tyler. He was the president from 1841 to 1845. And one of his famous quotes was, "I can never consent to being dictated to." Here is John Tyler. Now, if you remember last time, we talked about William Henry Harrison, who died of pneumonia after 1 month in office. John Tyler became the president after William Henry Harrison died. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. All right, as the 1807 valedictorian at William and Mary College, Tyler devoted his entire speech to the subject of the education of women. That's kind of a cool thing because the importance of women getting college education was not something that was on a lot of people's mind at the time, but it was on his mind. Tyler was the 6th of 8 presidents born in Virginia. No other state has produced as many presidents. So that's a fun fact for you. Virginia has had more presidents than any other state of the 50 states. Tyler, the first president born after the Revolutionary War, was the first vice president to become president after the death of a president. When William Henry Harrison died, Tyler immediately took the oath of office, moved into the White House, and assumed full presidential powers, a precedent that governed future successions. So a president had never died before, so there was kind of a question as to what it would look like. Would the vice president take over the whole job, or would he just kind of manage things until the next election, or what would happen? And he kind of set the precedent for, he was just going to come in and be the new president. Just take the job right away. Tyler had more children than any other president. He had 8 children with his first wife, Letitia, and 7 with his second wife, Julia. So he had a total of 15 children. Tyler's cabinet did not like the decisions he was making, so all of them except Daniel Webster resigned. He was also the first president to ever have a veto overridden by Congress. Now, Congress can pass a law. Congress is the legislative branch of the government. And then once Congress passes a law, the president can either sign the law or he can veto the law, which means he tries to do away with the law. Now, if the president vetoes something Congress does, Congress can override that veto if 2/3 of them vote to override it. And 2/3 would be 66%. And this happened to John Tyler. It was the first time it had ever happened. Former President John Tyler was elected to the Confederate House of Representatives in the 1860s. So he was the only U.S. president to serve in the government of the Confederate States of America. So his loyalties later in life shifted from the United States of America to the Confederate States of America. And Tyler was also a member of the Episcopal Church. All right, going to look now at James K. Polk. He was president from 1845 to 1849. And this is James K. Polk. Some of you guys may think this is cool. Lindsay Ford, who works at the Mustard Seed, her name before she got married was Lindsay Polk. And her family is actually distantly related to President James K. Polk. That's kind of cool, isn't it? James Polk was a North Carolina native. He had been governor of Tennessee before becoming president. He was nicknamed Young Hickory because Andrew Jackson was his mentor. Remember, Andrew Jackson was nicknamed Old Hickory. He was a friend of Francis Scott Key, composer of the Star-Spangled Banner. During his presidency, 525,000 square miles were added to the United States when California and New Mexico became U.S. territory. Before that, these areas had belonged to Mexico. It was during Polk's presidency that gold was discovered in California in 1848, leading to the California Gold Rush, which lasted until 1855. Because 1849 was the peak year of the gold rush, people who rushed to make their fortune in California were nicknamed 49ers. And this is where the San Francisco NFL team gets its name. Polk was a slaveholder for most of his adult life, and he owned a plantation in Mississippi and bought slaves while president. So Polk's another example of a man who not only did he not work to oppose this great injustice in America, but again, he participated in it. Polk was a member of the Presbyterian Church. That's, again, like I said, one of the sad parts. You don't see this horrible injustice of slavery was being carried out not by godless people, but by people who identify themselves as church-going Christians, which is all the more sad. The next president after James K. Polk was Zachary Tyler, the 12th president, and he was president from 1840. I'm sorry, that's a mistake. He was president from 1849 to 1850. 1849 to 1850. Here's a picture of Zachary Taylor. All right. He had never voted in a presidential election before his presidency. He was not particularly interested or involved in politics. He was nicknamed Old Rough and Ready by his soldiers because of the sloppy way that he dressed. He stood against the expansion of slavery, recommending that California be admitted as a free state. Taylor was the second president to die in office. Almost immediately after his death, rumors began to circulate that Taylor was poisoned by pro-slavery Southerners, and similar theories persisted into the 21st century. In 1991, his body was dug up and autopsied. No poison was found, and it was determined that he had most likely died of cholera. But anyway, that was this theory that still gets talked about some. So when he died, his vice president became the new president. And his vice president... Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on. Got a couple more quotes about Zachary Taylor. Taylor's daughter, Sarah, grew up and married Jefferson Davis, who would become the president of the Confederate States of America during the Civil War. And Taylor was a member of the Episcopal Church. All right, when he died, his vice president became the new president. That was Millard Fillmore, who was the 13th president. He was president from 1850 to 1853. And this is a picture of Millard Fillmore. Now, Millard Fillmore is not one of the best-known presidents today. A few years ago, about 11 years ago, my wife and I got a cat. And we thought it'd be fun to name our cat after an unknown 19th century president. So we named our cat Millard Fillmore. So it's kind of a fun fact for you. Let's talk about the actual Millard Fillmore now. Before becoming president, Fillmore had served as a delegate in the New York Assembly, where he had introduced a bill that would outlaw imprisonment for debt. Fillmore, the first president born in the 1800s, was the last member of the Whig Party to become president, giving him the nickname the last of the Whigs. That was a political party that existed for a few years in the early days of America's history, and then it kind of just went extinct. Fillmore owned over 4,000 books and established the first White House library. Fillmore was responsible for the Compromise of 1850. It abolished the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and established the Fugitive Slave Act, which made it much more difficult for slaves to escape. It's called the Compromise of 1850 because it was meant to make anti-slavery Americans and pro-slavery Americans both a little happy. Fugitive Slave Act was such a bad thing, it's hard to see how you could be happy with any part of the compromise. Fillmore personally opposed slavery, but didn't believe it was worth having a civil war over. You find that among a lot of pre-Civil War presidents. They said that they were personally opposed to slavery, which essentially meant they didn't think it was a good idea, but they weren't going to do anything about it. And sadly, you see that same mindset today. Just like slavery was the fundamental moral crisis of the 19th century, abortion is the fundamental moral crisis of American society today. And you have a lot of politicians who say that they're personally opposed to it, but they don't believe that they need to do anything about it. And that's really sad. Fillmore was a member of the Unitarian Church, just like John Adams and John Quincy Adams had been. All right, the 14th president, Franklin Pierce, he was president from 1853 to 1857. And this is Franklin Pierce. I thought the picture's kind of odd. He's got his hand stuffed in his coat. Looks like he's reaching for something. It was actually kind of a normal pose for these old-fashioned portraits. Pierce was a Democrat. He was pro-slavery and supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which let new territories entering the Union decide for themselves whether or not to be slave states. Some anti-slavery groups argued that no new states moving into the Union could be slave states, period. And Pierce, though, wanted each state to determine whether it wanted to be a slave state. Taking that approach, of course, meant that if enough states wanted it, you could have any number of slave states, potentially, if enough people wanted it. So this Kansas-Nebraska Act, which said instead of, firmly saying no more slave states entering the country, let's let every state decide whether they want to be a slave state. This angered a lot of people in the North who wanted no new slave states in the Union. Pierce's Secretary of War was Jefferson Davis, who went on to become President of the Confederate States of America. Pierce was a friend of Nathaniel Hawthorne, the author famous for writing the Scarlet Letter. And Pierce, like so many presidents before him, was a member of the Episcopal Church. All right, next on the list is James Buchanan. This is going to carry us up to the Civil War period. This is a picture of President James Buchanan. I think in that picture he looks a little bit like Anthony Hopkins, the actor. All right, Buchanan is the only president ever elected from Pennsylvania. Buchanan was the only president who remained a bachelor for life. Never got married. Southern states began seceding from the Union toward the end of Buchanan's presidency. Buchanan opposed this, but didn't believe the Constitution gave him authority to do anything about it. Pro-slavery Southerners didn't like Abraham Lincoln because he had made it clear that he didn't approve of slavery. And so before he was even inaugurated, after the November 1860 election, states started to pull away from the United States of America to form this new thing called the Confederacy, intended to protect the institution of slavery from Abraham Lincoln's interference. Buchanan angered Northerners by endorsing the controversial Dred Scott Supreme Court decision. This court decision had ruled that no one of African ancestry, whether slave or free, could ever have the right of U.S. citizenship. It's a terrible Supreme Court decision, arguably one of the worst, but Buchanan actually supported the decision, which is really shameful. Buchanan was a member of the Presbyterian Church. So that's going to take us to where we're going to go this week as far as presidential history. We're going to discuss some other things before moving on, though. Some miscellaneous information about presidential faces on money. Most American money features presidents' faces. Abraham Lincoln is on the penny and the $5 bill. George Washington is on the quarter and the $1 bill. Thomas Jefferson is on the nickel, and Andrew Jackson's face is on the $20 bill. Franklin Roosevelt's on the dime. The only two non-presidents to currently adorn U.S. money are Founding Father Benjamin Franklin, who's on the $100 bill, and Founding Father Alexander Hamilton, who's on the $10 bill. All right, so as we've discussed the presidents up to this point, I've tried to talk about their record on the issue of slavery, and I want to give that a little bit more attention because to me it's an important topic. It helps you put the Civil War in perspective. So in total, 12 presidents owned slaves at some point in their lives, 8 of whom owned slaves while serving as president. George Washington was the first president to own slaves, including while he was president. Zachary Taylor was the last president to own slaves during his presidency. And Ulysses S. Grant was the last president to have owned a slave at some point in his life. Slave owning was common among early presidents. Of the first 12, only John Adams and his son John Quincy Adams never owned slaves, although 2 of the others, Martin Van Buren and William Henry Harrison, did not own slaves while they were president. The U.S. presidents who owned the most slaves was Thomas Jefferson with 600 or more, followed by George Washington with 200 slaves. The presidents who owned the fewest slaves were Martin Van Buren and Ulysses S. Grant with 1 slave each. We're going to look at individual presidents now and give you some numbers. George Washington, it's approximated that he owned about 317 slaves. He was a major slaveholder both before, during, and after his presidency. His will freed his slaves pending the death of his widow, though she freed his slaves within a year of his death. Like I said, Thomas Jefferson, who was number 3, he owned 600 plus slaves. The 4th president, James Madison, owned 100 or more. Madison proposed the 3/5 compromise, which counted 3 out of every 5 slaves for the purpose of taxation and legislative representation. He did not free his slaves in his will. Paul Jennings, one of Madison's slaves, served him during his presidency and later published the first memoir of life in the White House. That's particularly sad for James Madison because he wrote the Bill of Rights, which is such a powerful statement of human freedom. And that a man who did that could own slaves and support the institution of slavery is just really, really sad. Number 5, I mentioned this earlier, James Monroe was a slave owner. He owned about 75 slaves. He supported sending freed slaves to the new country of Liberia, and its capital, Monrovia, is named after him. Andrew Jackson, number 7, owned about 200 slaves. He owned slaves during his presidency. He faced several controversies related to slavery during his presidency. During his campaign for the White House, he faced criticism for being a slave trader, and he did not free any of his slaves in his will. Martin Van Buren, like we said earlier, only owned 1 slave. That was a man named Tom. He escaped in 1814. Later in life, we mentioned earlier, Van Buren belonged to the Free Soil Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western Territories without advocating for abolitionism outright. So there were kind of 3 positions about slavery that we're going to talk about more next week. Some were just altogether for it, some were altogether against it, and some kind of occupied a middle position where they weren't completely against it, but they were very much for it remaining limited in a certain location and not expanding. And that was kind of Van Buren's position. William Henry Harrison, 9th president, owned 11 slaves. He had inherited a lot of slaves, and as the first governor of the Indiana Territory, he unsuccessfully lobbied Congress to legalize slavery in Indiana. So he tried unsuccessfully to make Indiana a slave state. John Tyler owned about 70 slaves. He never freed any of them in his will, and he consistently supported slavery and its expansion during his time in political office. James K. Polk owned about 25 slaves. He became the Democratic nominee for president in 1844 because of his pro-slavery stance. His will provided for the freeing of his slaves after the death of his wife. Zachary Taylor, the 12th president, owned around 150 slaves. And although he owned slaves throughout his life, he generally resisted attempts to expand slavery in the territories. So he actually made enemies among a lot of pro-slavery Americans because he was firmly for not expanding slavery outside of the South. And then the last president to ever own slaves was the second to last was Andrew Johnson. He owned 8 slaves. As military governor of Tennessee, Andrew Johnson had convinced Abraham Lincoln to exempt that area from the Emancipation Proclamation. And then last was Ulysses S. Grant. He owned 1 slave, William Jones, who was given to him in 1857 by his father-in-law, and Grant freed him on March 29th, 1859, 2 years later. So that's a quick recap of presidential presidents that owned slaves and kind of what their position was on the subject. Before we stop this week's video, we're going to do a quick spotlight of Frederick Douglass, who himself was a freed slave, because he has a lot to teach us about this topic and how it kind of should shape our understanding of 19th century America. This is Frederick Douglass. I'll show you a picture of him. Great man. All right. Frederick Douglass lived from 1818 to 1895. Frederick Douglass's autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, was published in 1845, many years before the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. Douglass, who had fled from Maryland to New York to find freedom, was taking a great risk in publishing his life story because legally it was quite easy at the time for a runaway slave to be captured in whatever free state he lived and brought back into captivity. Douglas temporarily fled to England shortly after the book's publication. Douglas's story is heartbreaking from the very beginning. So many of the things we build our identity upon, Douglas was deprived of. He never knew who his father was, though it was speculated that it could have been one of the white men on the plantation. And he only saw his mother on a couple of occasions. It is believed that he was born around 1818, but since no records were kept of slave births, he had no birthday he could celebrate. Though Douglas had been treated inhumanely throughout his formative years, and though American society as a whole had a dehumanizing perspective of black people, Douglas somehow emerged as a young adult with a firm grasp of his own inherent dignity and value. He believed in his own humanity, even if others didn't. He narrates the story of how, as a teenager, his master tried to whip him. For the first time, Douglas decided to stand up for himself and fight back. He knew very well that he was taking his life into his hands by challenging his master, but he stood his ground, and that master never tried to beat him again. Douglas was the epitome of a self-taught man. Never allowed to get an education, Douglas taught himself to read and write by asking white children to show him the ABCs. He would practice on a fence with a piece of chalk. He persevered, though, and later in life became such a refined writer and speaker that some audiences had trouble believing he had ever been an uneducated slave in the first place. Despite the fact that the cruel masters Douglas knew throughout his youth were all professing Christians, Douglas came to embrace the Christian faith for himself, seeing that the real noble Jesus shouldn't be confused with the heartless, ignoble people who were using his name. That he was able to see past the distorted religious veneer of his masters and come to understand authentic Christianity is a testament to Douglas's remarkable open-mindedness as well as his gift of discernment. To Douglas, who had grown up under the harsh conditions of slavery, being regularly beaten with the whip by a sadistic master, American slavery represented the worst side of humanity. Churches that approved of it, Douglas said, were Christian in name only, having nothing in common with the religion of peace and freedom preached by Jesus Christ. Douglas likened the pro-slavery churches to the Pharisees of Jesus' day, saying that though they had an abundance of religion, they had no love for God, seeing as how they so obviously had no love for their fellow black man, that is. As he attacked the pro-slavery churches, he was at times accused of undermining religion. This was his reply. Quote, "I love the religion of our blessed Savior. I love that religion that sends its votaries to bind up the wounds of him that has fallen among thieves. I love that religion that makes it the duty of its disciples to visit the fatherless and the widow in their affliction. I love that religion that is based on the glorious principle of love to God and love to man, which makes its followers do unto others as they would be done by. If you demand liberty to yourself, it says, grant it to your neighbor. It is because I love this religion that I hate the slave-holding, woman-whipping, the mind-darkening, the soul-destroying religion that exists in the southern states of America. It is because I regard the one as good and pure and holy that I cannot but regard the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked." In his lifelong quest to see the captives set free, Douglas embodied a Christ-like passion to eradicate injustice and oppression wherever he encountered it. When slavery was outlawed, he didn't retire but continued to advocate for equality for black citizens. He advocated for women's rights and argued for women's suffrage, even though this was not a popular stance to take. Another Christ-like trait one sees in him is that though Douglas's rhetoric against slavery is fierce and impassioned, one never senses any bitterness on Douglas's part. In fact, he even made a point to visit the man who had been his cruel master when the man was lying on his deathbed. This trait, this ability to endure unspeakable atrocities and yet emerge with the ability to really embrace life and not simply coast through it with a chronic spirit of resentment, this resilience, more than anything else, is what makes the biographies and autobiographies of African American slaves so important for young people to read. Douglas's ability to believe so firmly in his own humanity when everyone around him sought to dehumanize him, coupled with his ability not to turn around and dehumanize those who had hurt him, make him a hero and a role model for all Americans, regardless of one's race. All right, so that's going to wrap us up for this week. Next week, we're going to start in 1860, looking at the Civil War era. Hope you guys can come back and join us. Thanks a lot, guys. God bless you.